So, how do pastors help people with mental
Yeah.
health issues when
Yeah.
they have mental health issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think having a mental health issue as a pastor precludes you from helping others with mental health issues. I think, in fact, that might even provide a good kind of way of empathizing and building up that understanding or compassion, especially as fellow strugglers. So I don't think mental health issues are not things that pastors should not struggle with because they're people. And so, as people helping people, I think, again, pastors can still, with mental health issues, be able to, counsel church members and others. Yeah.
And for a lot of currently serving pastors, mental health counseling and training was not a part of their seminary education,
Right,
was not a
right.
part of their high
Right.
school, college education.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of them feel really overwhelmed.
Yeah.
What would be your encouragement of how do they
Yeah.
move forward when they have not had any training at all?
Right. I think, first of all, I want to say that if they're overwhelmed, they should be overwhelmed because you're really getting to such deep struggles and vulnerable things that a lot of church members will bring to their awareness. And so if they are feeling overwhelmed, they should be, because what they're experiencing is the overwhelm of their parishioner, right? It's they're really sharing in that kind of overwhelm and experience. That's not to say then that if they're overwhelmed, then they should, be able to then counsel them, and in their overwhelm, they should just kind of like push through. So what I'm saying by that is, first of all, being able to acknowledge that with their parishioner, and then be able to love them in the midst by sharing how their issues are very important, and that they do have compassion about them. Secondly, I think that in the midst of that kind of let's say a conversation, I'm imagining when a parishioner comes and they're coming to their pastor, that the pastor can also, in humility, be able to share their lack of understanding or training to be able to help them, but in terms of the maybe, let's say, specific counseling issue that may be that they may deeply struggle with. And while they share the humility of their lack of maybe training in that area, they can also share, however, that they do have training or understanding of the depth of the Word of God that can really minister to their heart in a powerful way, if the parishioner is open to that. Right? So being able to build that kind of agreement together and acknowledgement of, what the kind of counseling or ministry could look like will be really helpful for the parishioner. So having said that, it doesn't mean then that oftentimes when parishioners come, while they deeply need the ministry of the gospel, oftentimes that they may not be coming in for that, right? They may be coming in for, I want relief from this suffering, right? Can you help me find some relief? I'm really struggling with an addiction or anxiety or depression. And so they're coming in for relief. So being able to understand that the gospel kind of Word of God will really address the deep issues of their heart that might be behind the depression or anxiety is something that the parishioner can understand, or the church member may need to understand. And then from that, they may have to also acknowledge, if they really, really want also relief of the suffering, that they should talk about that too. And that in that kind of instance, or in that part of the journey, a pastor being able to suggest and refer them to someone who could help them with their particular suffering and need for relief can be something that they could talk about.
Yeah. And that referring, right,
Yeah.
to therapy or counseling or psychiatrist,
Right,
psychologist.
right.
I mean, that stigma has definitely shifted,
It
right?
it has.
Like, so much.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Yeah.
what do you see as kind of the way that stigma maybe has still evolved, or what is kind of your hope for, especially the Asian American church's relationship with professional mental health?
Yeah, yeah. That's a complicated one. I think the Asian American church, because there are so many different kinds of levels of needs or understanding. People are coming from so many perspectives that maybe a first step in the, let's say, an Asian American church might be, how do you really start to raise awareness for the need of heart change in the midst of issues, right? So maybe, raising awareness in the church, as as I mentioned about church-wide kind of, training or development, that might help then church members to consider when they go out for counseling that while they may get, let's say, their suffering might reduce in some way, that it may not necessarily target their relationship with Jesus. And how is it important for the church to help the church member to be aware that may be more important in light of eternity, maybe not in light of the current kind of instant, but definitely in light of eternity, how important that direction is. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a conjunction.
Right. How do you really partner? That's why I think it's important that while you send them out and they really get relief, because God's common grace is it's there, it exists. And by his common grace, he's enabled folks to be able to address, unbelievers, to be able to address these kinds of issues and find a lot of relief, right? And while we in the church understand relief may not be the core kind of, target, but again, really a relationship with Jesus is important. The Bible doesn't also, the Bible doesn't ignore the importance of suffering relief from suffering. So it is that kind of constant relationship and awareness of how to talk about things as parishioners go out and then come back in.
And then taking that second part, right? Like, how does the church, especially Asian American church, right? What are some of the ways that you've seen Asian American churches provide that, like, deeper application of the gospel into people's mental health, whether it be depression or anxiety or trauma?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's there. I guess that's why I'm hoping that more churches will start to really provide, let's say, seminars, or even pastors may talk about it in their sermons. Will that part of the counseling ministry really be developed a lot more, so that it is not like, oh, maybe once in a while this happens, but it's a constant kind of ministry that is built and developed to lay that foundation.
And then what would you say, I think because pastors a lot of times will take that burden onto themselves,
right,
which is
not helpful.
Right? What does it look like in your, or even just as a template, what does it look like to try to build that culture in your church? Yeah.
That is like the hardest piece. I do agree that pastors can't take it on themselves to bear the whole burden of that culture change, but it does have to come from the top, right? So being able to understand the kind of authority or position that they have to invigorate, to incite, to share their passion about the importance of, maybe in the ways that they have available, or the time that's available, like in a sermon. How do they start to use that voice that they have and be able to talk about it.
And kind of even going back to where we started, I know as a former preaching pastor myself, right?
Right.
There's always this conundrum of, am I sharing things that I've processed, or am I sharing things that I'm processing? And with things like mental health, it's really hard to draw that. Like physical health, it's easy. It's like, my leg, I can walk again, right? Like, but mental health, how would you say is helpful maybe for, especially preaching pastors, to evaluate when is a good discernment for me to share these things publicly? When I haven't maybe, because with mental health, sometimes we don't feel like we've ever fully healed. Right?
Yeah. Because it's such a journey, and it might be a lifelong journey. Because if we think about it in the context of sanctification, it is a lifelong journey.
So how are ways, and you may not know, but how are potential ways that a pastor could try to make that discernment? Yeah,
I think that idea of discernment about whether they're in process or have processed is a good question to ask. At the same time, I think more than am I processing or have processed, maybe how are my sermons or how is my message affected by either processed, the issue being processed or or still processing. Like, you don't have to make a real big distinction about it, but I think what's important is being aware that it could still impact your message. Like, let's say, for example, one doesn't know that they've processed it, but think that they have, right? And then they feel really like, hey, that was, I'm struggling less. And then, might the pastor start to say, I did it, so you can do it, and the journey might look different. So will they be thoughtful about, the angle at which they're going to come while they're preaching about, their struggles or having struggled? That's a hard question, actually. I think that's something to think about a little bit more. Right.
Physical healing, again, it's obvious.
Yeah, it is, right.
Well, then I think in terms of leaderships beyond preaching pastors, right? We are now more aware of a lot of these warning signs of mental health illness that in the past we would have just pushed through.
Yeah, or put on the back burner.
Right, or put on the back burner. But what does it mean, the sense of community, right? How do you bring those up with your friends, with your church members?
As a pastor or leader?
Or as a leader. Right?
Okay.
Like, hey, how do I talk to you because I'm worried about you, right? Without, like it being like attacking.
Right.
Because that's what I know for me, it's like almost like you don't want to ever go to somebody and be like, hey, I think you're depressed.
Right.
Like, and then they're like, no, I'm fine.
Right.
Like, oh,
yeah.
Right. So how do you kind of navigate that dialogue?
Yeah.
Right?
Among pastors and leaders, right? So that the culture of counseling ministry and their ability to be humble and open and genuine be practiced from the top. That's a really good question. I guess conferences like this help to, invite pastors and leaders to say, hey, slow down and recognize the importance of mental health or counseling issues. I also think that, so one of the kind of challenges is that a lot of the times men, and a lot of pastors are men, and men do have historically have a little bit more of a difficult time connecting with the knowledge that they're struggling. So it may not be just that they're not being vulnerable or denying it, but it may be that they have grown not to really actually be aware of it too. So it is an issue to be thoughtful about. I imagine that, a lot of pastors and leaders hearing a lot of the talks about abuse in the church or spiritual abuse or counseling needs or the importance of counseling, I imagine that many of them are on board. They're like, yeah, we should do that. But I also think it might be hard for them to know how they themselves connect to that, if that makes sense. Yeah. So it is a complicated issue. I keep saying it's complicated because it's actually complex, because it's not like a simple answer that, well, here's how a pastor should approach another pastor. Because oftentimes pastors, while they recognize the importance of the counseling ministry, that sometimes they're really actually not aware that they do have that need, even though they're very compassionate about it.
And I think it's helpful to hear that it is complicated. It is complex. Because it's easy to think, well, if I just follow these 1, 2, 3 steps, right? But it is this process of sanctification, of understanding yourself and understanding God. I think, just in this current climate where mental health issues are much more prevalent and being brought to the forefront, but as well, like in the world sense, there's this kind of battle between despair, right, and hope. What do you feel like is some of the things about God and about the gospel that really give you hope in the midst of all this mental health issues that are going on?
For myself personally, I know that the Word of God and and the hope that He gives to us and the promises that He has for me is deeply important. And if I were to say that what gives me hope is, I find hope in. And I guess, let me just, an aside, I know that I'm imagining you're going to be editing in, okay? As an aside, I've experienced a lot of, I guess you can say, physical struggles in the past couple of years, not only with the pandemic, kind of, collective trauma, but I've gone through cancer just in the last 2 years. My husband, he also almost passed away a couple of years ago through, after his heart surgery. And so it's really impacted the way that I think while I am both a biblical counselor and a psychologist in training, in having been trained in those areas, I do think that the greatest hope that I find in terms of all the suffering that we have gone through is the knowledge that we will be received because of Christ and because of His sacrifice and because of the power of the resurrection. And so that does give me the deepest hope, knowing that that can never be taken away, whether because I'm, Asian, or whether I've done this or that, or not done this or that. Or if I was about to die or not about to. The promise that Jesus indeed has received me by His blood is the greatest hope.